big fundamental questions that we want to talk about today is what are or how does the president get power? And is the president too powerful or not powerful enough? Certainly Alexander Hamilton in Federalist number 70 was concerned about which of those two? Yeah, Hamilton was concerned that the president would not be powerful enough, and that we needed a strong president to be able to do things. But over the course of our history, the power of the presidency has increased significantly, although incrementally over time, right? Washington, of course, expands the power of the presidency right off the bat by doing things like creating a cabinet. Jefferson's going to expand the powers of the presidency in foreign policy. Jackson expands the power of the presidency to basically be based on the president as a person as opposed to the president as a constitutional abstract. If you have no idea what that means, just remember that Jackson believed that he could veto laws just because he didn't like them, whereas previously it was thought that vetoes were only supposed to be used if a law was actually unconstitutional. Lincoln expands the powers of the presidency through the Civil War and the creation of the Union as an ideal. And then we've got Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson and FDR and so on and so forth. So the powers of the president have certainly expanded over time. But still, some presidents are more powerful or more successful at wielding power than others. And there are questions about why that might be, right? We can look at things like presidential personality or the economy or the global situation. But we also want to be able to talk intelligently about what makes a president powerful. So all that to say that we're going to be looking at the executive branch. Your notes packet is updated except for that because I have a problem and literally can't help myself. We're going to be doing the charts in reverse order. So we'll do the second chart first. But, everything's there. Okay. So to begin, and this is like big, broad idea kind of stuff. If there's anything here that's unfamiliar to you, you might want to note it down. But if not, we're just kind of thinking in a big picture here. Do you think the president has more power in foreign policy or domestic policy? Foreign by a long shot. Can you tell me why? Who does he not have to compete with internationally that he has to compete with here in the United States? Congress, right? There's no Congress to worry about. Internationally, there's no legislature who's in charge of his actions or creates the policy. The president himself is in charge of foreign policy because the president is the one who negotiates treaties and assigns ambassadors. So foreign policy is the place of greatest formal power. What does the word formal mean? Keep going. Constitutional, assigned, codified in the Constitution, right? Foreign policy is the place of the greatest formal power, but we know that domestically the president has really expanded his powers a lot over the course of history, and we can talk about why. The phrase going public, this is your mini quiz reading for this unit, I think. And it's just a phrase that you want to kind of be familiar with and what it means. Essentially, it's the idea that the president can use his power as like a news magnet to hold a press conference. All the networks will drop whatever they're doing to cover the press conference. And so the president can really speak directly to the American people. And in doing so, the president can maybe convince or persuade the people to put pressure on their congressmen to get something done. So this is an informal power, and some presidents are better at it than others. Anyway, you'll read about that as we go forward. Okay, so the first question is, who are the presidents? And constitutionally, the requirements are pretty simple. What are they? You have to be at least 35 years old, although practically, the youngest president ever has been 42. Okay, what else? You have to be a natural-born U.S. citizen. Does that mean you have to be born here in the United States? No, you have to be born. The idea of natural-born versus a naturalized citizen is that naturalized citizens are at some point not a citizen and then made a citizen through the process of naturalization. Natural-born citizens are citizens from birth. So anyone born on U.S. soil is a natural-born citizen. Automatically, they become a U.S. citizen. But if your parents are U.S. citizens, no matter where in the world you are born, you are automatically a U.S. citizen too. So fatefully, Ted Cruz, right, was born in Canada, but to an American citizen mother, and so he then is a U.S. citizen. And the last constitutional requirement? Yeah, you have to have 14 years residency. So, Ted Cruz was born in Canada, but he spent the last 14 or more years here in the United States. That qualifies him to be president. But informally, take a look at our wall of illustrious presidents. What are the informal requirements for being a president? A man. You do have to be a man for sure. What else? All right. Okay, generally, being taller is better. Don't tell it to Quincy Adams and Adams. They were both super short. What else? Tend to be pretty wealthy. Have to be Christian, or at least so far they've all been Christian. Tend to be pretty good public speakers, with a few exceptions. Well, except for President Obama, they're all pretty white. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So there's that. That's just actual. Okay. If we look at the presidents in the modern era, those around when better photographic technology allowed for their image to be widely shown, they don't have any more facial hair, right? William Taft was the last president with facial hair. They are reasonably photogenic. I'm not saying they're going to win any beauty pageants, but with a few exceptions, maybe Lyndon Johnson, they're doing pretty good. So certainly there are these informal requirements for the president. So maybe requirement is a strong word, but the notion that just anybody can be president is maybe not quite accurate. For example, at least for now, the times will change. For example, 10 years ago, we would have speculated that it would be very unlikely to have an African-American president, and then we had one. But at least for now, we can't imagine in the near future having, for example, an openly gay president or a significantly disabled president, right? And there are even those who are still concerned that we can't imagine having a female president, right? So there are these sort of informal barriers to becoming president, or at least standards. So let's talk about the benefits to being the president. Officially, it's pretty minor. They only get about $400,000 a year, which is, I mean, plenty if you're a teacher. I would take that for sure. But if we compare to the average salary of the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and when you think about it, the president's kind of like the CEO of, say, the most powerful country in the world. The pay is, nothing comparatively. So the idea is we want our first of all, the theoretical idea is that we want our presidents to be in it for something besides the money. You don't go to the presidency to become rich. But practically what it means is that the only people who can really afford to be president are already pretty rich on their own, right? Which is kind of getting off topic here, but lots of state legislatures, like Texas, for example, the pay for a Texas legislator is I don't know, $7,000 a year or something. In New Mexico, maybe they get no pay at all, or $200, or anyway, it's really small. And that's pretty typical, especially in the South, of state legislatures. And the idea is, again, to avoid corruption, people shouldn't get into the legislature to get rich or whatever. But the outcome is that the kinds of people who can afford to do that tend to be fairly limited. So anyway, that was an aside. But there are other benefits to being the president, like living at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue with a full staff, and a cook who can create for you anything that you want at any hour of the day or night, and celebrity status, and a limo, and oh yeah, your private jumbo jet airplane, and a helicopter. Anyway, there are some other benefits. It might be, fun for a bit. So there are two basic ways to become the president of the United States. The first and most obvious is to be elected. How do you get elected president? Yeah, you win your election. I was looking for the Electoral College, right? So you get how many electoral votes? 270 electoral votes will do it. So that's the most common way. And as we know, the 22nd Amendment limits presidents to just 2 terms. This is a trick question, which by announcing that I think makes it not a trick question. How many years maximum can the president serve? Yeah, the answer is 10. How could that be if 1 term is 4 years, so 2 terms equal 8 years? Yeah, so if you're vice president and you assume the presidency in the middle of your president's term, or your previous president's term, if you serve half or less of their term, you can still run for 2 of your own terms. So for example, LBJ, JFK was shot in 1963 after serving 3 years, being president for 3 years. So LBJ served only about 1.5 years of JFK's presidency, and so he was eligible to run for 2 more full terms of his own. On the other hand, the 22nd Amendment didn't exist then, But if we had had the 22nd Amendment, when Teddy Roosevelt became president in 1901, when William McKinley was shot, that was only 1 year after McKinley was elected. So Teddy Roosevelt served almost all of McKinley's term, 3 full years of McKinley's term. So if the 22nd Amendment had been around, Teddy Roosevelt would not have been eligible to run for a second term of his own, because that would have been more than allowed. Okay, the other basic way to become president is via the process of succession, which can happen either if the president in front of you dies, or if the president in front of you is impeached. And so 1 in 5 vice presidents, interestingly, have eventually succeeded to the presidency. Not all of them. Both. That statistic includes both. The list down here includes all of the incomplete presidential terms, so where the vice presidents are going to step in for a president who has either died or been removed from office, kind of in Nixon's case. So the 25th Amendment provides for that process. So if the president dies, who becomes president? And you might think that's obvious, that why do we have to make an amendment to figure all that out? But here's the thing, before the 25th Amendment, there was a little bit of confusion. If the president dies and the vice president takes office, is the vice president now the president, like who gets the presidential salary and should live in the presidential, like in the White House, and has all of the honors, like it becomes a commander-in-chief, has the same kind of power over policy? Or is the vice president more like just the acting president who has kind of emergency only power? What if Mrs. Elder, heaven forbid, were to have an accident? Maybe she goes skiing over spring break and she has an accident, and for whatever, she needs to stay home. She's maybe breaks her leg, whatever it is. So if that happened, and then they so maybe she had to stay home for 6 weeks or something. Well, we can't be principal-less for 6 weeks. So they would probably choose one of the assistant principals to be acting principal while Mrs. Elder was away. But as acting principal, can they make major changes to policy? No, they can't, right? They understand that they're just a placeholder, that they weren't hired to be the principal, that all they're doing is kind of doing the minimum things that are required by the principal to keep the school going. Does that make sense? So before the 25th Amendment, there was confusion about, does the vice president become the president with all the power of the presidency or not? But the 25th Amendment says yes, they do. But what if the president and vice president, I don't know, sit down to some ill-fated dinner and have some undercooked chicken or something, get food poisoning, and both of them die within minutes of one another? Then what? Or the Speaker of the House becomes president. Ooh, but what if the Speaker, the President, and the Vice President, they all out for an ill-fated round of golf? Freak lightning strike. Then who's president? The President pro tempore of the Senate, right? So the most senior member of the majority party in the Senate would then become president. But, oh no, what if there's some giant gathering where all of Congress and the President and the Vice President are all together at the same time, say the State of the Union address, and the roof collapses and they all perish tragically? Then who becomes president? Yeah, so then it's all of the cabinet members in order of the creation of their departments. Secretary of State is first, then Treasury, then Defense, and then all the way down through the most recent, the last person in line for the presidency is the Secretary of Homeland Security, which is the most recent cabinet office. And that is why you guys have heard of the designated survivor, perhaps? It is, but I have never watched. It doesn't look very good. Yeah, so if at any time there is a big gathering of most of the leaders of the U.S. government, so at this, the inauguration or the State of the Union address, they choose one of the people way down the line, somebody not important enough to get a fancy seat. Somebody way down the line, and for 36 hours they basically get to be the president. So beginning the day before the event, they get briefings, including some super top secret information that only the president would otherwise know. Not all the top secret information, but things like where we have our nuclear subs stationed, or things that might be important in the event of a catastrophe. And then on the day of the event, this person, whose identity is kept secret until after the fact, is whisked away to some unknown location that is capable of withstanding nuclear attack, where they are guarded by the Secret Service and referred to as Mr. or Madam President the entire time. The nuclear football, the briefcase with the codes to facilitate nuclear launch, goes with them, which sounds either like the coolest or most terrifying thing possible. Bring some cards. Yeah, I don't know. So there's that. Okay. So how do we impeach the president? Can we just remind ourselves? What's step 1 of impeachment? So who votes in the articles of impeachment? The House of Representatives. And then step 2? The Senate holds a trial either to convict, that's not even a word. Convict or not convict. If they convict, the president will be removed from office. Has that ever happened? No, it would have happened with Nixon, but he resigned before that could happen. So there we go. Okay, so now we're on to that second chart thingy. Political scientists, unlike historians, at least try to be clever when they name things. So these are the so-called 7 hats of the president. Anybody? No? You know, like the phrase, he wears many hats? Okay. Well, anyway, so these are the 7 hats of the president, and we're going to talk about just what they mean in each sense. On Thursday, I think we're going to be meeting in the social studies lab. I'll put it on Schoology because it might be the library. It's sort of up in the air. And you're going to be grading President Obama on each of these 7 roles. So how does he do in each case? So first, there's the president is chief citizen. And as chief citizen, it's the president's job to sort of like embody what it means to be an American. So for example, like you guys have all seen, you know, the footage where the president goes and casts his vote on election day, you know, and it's like, ooh, the president's doing his civic duty. And it's kind of like, you should do that too. Look, be a good person like the president is. Or the president is it represents the American people when the president like lays the wreath on the tomb of the unknown soldier or whatever. So again, sort of representing all of us, being who we're supposed to be in that way. Oh, this is kind of controversial because you know how we said that Congress is super unrepresentative of the American public? Well, the presidency is way more unrepresentative of the American public. And so there's a bit of controversy, like, does the president really represent who we are as a country if the presidents are all rich white men minus Obama, and then he was just a rich man. So there we go. So then we've got the chief of party. Can you remember the 3 aspects of the party? We had that big triangle. We talked about how the party has 3 heads. So the party in government. So the president is the head of the party in government. Then there's the party in the electorate. That's all of us and our political identifications. And then there's the party organization is the word but you're right about the party, like the chairman of the different parties. So the president is the head of the party in government and is therefore the highest ranking member of that party and is really representative of the party. And don't forget that we talked about how the fact that the president represents the party helps to hold the president accountable because the president doesn't want to make the rest of the party look bad, although some are more concerned with that than others. All right, then there's chief legislator. Which sounds kind of like weird because the president is the head of the executive branch, not the legislature. But remember that the president exists as a leader for Congress and can encourage Congress to pass laws, can veto laws or sign them, can call Congress to session, has a duty to report before Congress, like on the priorities of the country in the State of the Union address. So in that way, the president acts as a leader for Congress in creating policy for the country. Then the president is the chief diplomat, which is a pretty big deal because the president sort of represents our country to the rest of the world in terms of how our relationships are going to work. It's part of why there's so much hoopla being made about President-elect Trump's like overtures between Taiwan and China. It matters because even if it's not an official policy statement, even if it's just a silly tweet or a phone call, the president's persona is a major part of American diplomacy, and the president's ability or lack thereof to get along with other people in the world matters. It's also what Trump says is one of his biggest selling points. He's arguing that his ability to get along with Vladimir Putin is important because it will be important for global stability. And again, he's right in terms of the fact that his persona is an important part of how we're going to get along with other countries for the next 4 or 8 years. The president then is commander-in-chief, which means he's in charge of the military. Moving on. The president is the chief of state, and I always have to be careful with this one versus chief citizen. So as chief citizen, the president represents us individually. He's supposed to be the embodiment of what it means to be an American. As chief of state, the president represents us collectively, like to other countries. So, for example, when the president, you guys have all been to the Bush Library at least 7,000 times in your life, right? Remember that room with all the presidents from foreign dignitaries? And how the docent always tells you, like, they're not the property of President George H.W. Bush. They're the property of the American people, and they're just, you remember that speech? Yeah, we've heard it. I've heard it several times myself. So as chief of state, the president accepts gifts on behalf of the whole country. When the president speaks before the United Nations or appears before their countries representing us as a country, as opposed to us as individuals. And then finally, the president is the chief executive, or I think on your paper it says chief administrator. And what this means, or maybe at least you should put a little asterisk next to it, because this is where essentially all of the president's domestic powers come from. The president is in charge of the executive branch. He's in charge of the bureaucracy of the country. And it's that power that gives him pretty much all of the domestic powers that the president has. So it's a pretty big deal. While we're here, can someone define bureaucracy for me? Okay, bureaucracies also often involve committees. Yep. Does tend to like farm out the responsibilities of government. So the president can't do everything. He has a bureaucracy to help delegate tasks to. Can you give me an example of a bureaucratic agency? The FBI, the cabinet includes a whole bunch of, the IRS, Department of Homeland Security, Department of Agriculture, the Securities and Exchange Commission. All of the things of government are parts of bureaucracy. We're going to learn about that in more detail later, but you have to know the word at least, because as chief executive, that means he is in control of the entire bureaucracy. Okay, so what we're going to do now is, on the paper that you have, so you should be familiar with this diagram, we did it for Congress, but I recreated it here for you on your paper, but I also made 2 columns, and on my columns here, I have one listed as formal and one as informal. So I'm going to give you a few minutes, and I'd like for you with your tables to please brainstorm as many powers of the president as you can think of. Figure out which category they go in, and identify, are they formal or informal? Pause. What's the difference between formal and informal? Formal's in the Constitution. Informal has to do with precedent or like tradition or whatever. So, okay, work together as a team. Go. All right. So now that we are more energized, let's talk through some of these powers. So if we're looking at legislative powers of the president, of course, formally the president has the power to either sign or veto laws. Now, as a little asterisk or in the margin somewhere, I need you to write that the president does not, capital N-O-T, not, have the power of the line item veto. Let's pretend for a magical moment that I was appointed president of the United States, because I would never survive an election. And if I were appointed president and Congress had repealed Obamacare and they had this some replacement package that we have yet to hear anything about, and they put it before me, and I liked, let's say it was great, and I liked almost all of it, but they wanted to privatize Social Security, and I think that's a bad idea. Do I have the ability to veto that one little section and keep the rest? I do not. So as president, I might feel compelled to sign it into law, because the alternative would be that we got rid of our health care plan and then had nothing to replace it. That would be terrible, don't you think? So I probably would feel compelled to sign it into law, even though I don't like one particular piece of it. So guess what I might do then? Well, informally, I might decide that I am the president of the United States after all. So I could hold a press conference, and then I could praise Congress for creating a plan that's so useful for all of America. But then I might get out my little wagging finger and chastise those congressmen who unfortunately felt compelled to include such a misstep as to privatize Social Security. And I can assure the American public that my administration will continue to fund and provide for the Social Security Administration in full and as before. What I'm actually telling you is, screw you, Congress. I'm going to do what I want. And I can continue to do this however I'd like to. That is something called a signing statement. It is an informal power, and it happens. The president formally has the power to call special sessions of Congress. Formally, the president has the power to give the State of the Union address. And informally, the president can propose legislation. How do you know it's informal? Because only only members of Congress have the ability to introduce legislation. Remember that part? Nod your heads. Remember? Only members of Congress can do that, but the president can have an idea and write it up and encourage somebody in Congress to introduce it. Formal. Yeah, the president can call Congress. So like Congress was on recess for most of the second half of December and they just came back last week. If there was some kind of national emergency, the president could have called Congress and said, I know you're on vacation, too bad, come back. There's something we have to deal with. Okay, so the executive powers of the president are, so we're skipping down to chief administrator here. The executive powers of the president are pretty significant. So remember I told you that as chief administrator, as this like leader of the executive branch, the president has the most powers. So what are they? Well, it's been a while since you've seen this in your Constitution. I just lost mine there. Oh, here it is. But at the very beginning of Article 2, the one we did a long time ago when we did the Electoral College, the first sentence is really important but sounds super lame. Here's what it says. The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America. Period. Sounds lame, but hold on, let's think about that for a minute. Who has all of the power to execute, enforce, and carry out laws? Oh, President, that's right. One person. Just one person has all of that power, right? So it's an incredible amount of power. And so let's talk about some more of the details. The president, of course, can appoint people and or remove them from office. So when the president is unhappy with your job, they can just kick you out and appoint somebody to replace you. A little exception here, you probably have no idea what that means, but for now, if you would just write it down for me. An IRC is an independent regulatory commission, and we're going to talk about them next week when we talk about the bureaucracy. But for now, just know that the president can't fire members of the independent regulatory commissions, IRCs. So some limits to that power. Now, then there's executive orders, which I'm not sure if they really count as executive power or legislative power, but I put them in the executive category because they only have power because they affect the bureaucracy. So to give you a good example, almost 4 years ago now, President Obama, in his first State of the Union after re-election, one of the things he asked Congress to do was to raise the minimum wage to a so-called living wage, which he said was at least $10 an hour. But did Congress do it? No, they were controlled by the Republicans. They didn't want to do that. They thought it was going to have unintended consequences, etc. So would President Obama have liked to raise minimum wage for all those McDonald's employees in the country? He would have liked to, right? He said out loud that was his goal. But can he do it by himself? No, because he has no authority over McDonald's in and of himself. But what did he do instead? He passed an executive order that raised the minimum wage of all federal employees to $10 an hour. And can he do that? Yes, he can, because he is entirely in control of the executive branch of the government, which includes all of the bureaucracy. Now, there is a little bit of a caveat here, or as we like to say, a big but. And the big but is this. Does the president get extra money to pay those higher salaries now? He does not. So if he chose, and he did, to raise minimum wage for all federal employees $10 an hour, that is going to more quickly deplete the budgets of all of those departments that are hiring minimum wage employees. So he can do it. He has the power to do so, but he is limited because Congress provides appropriations. And so now he's got to find a way to do everything else he wants to do with a little bit less money because of these higher wages. The same thing applies to like President-elect Trump's proposals to, for example, begin deportations. Can he do that? Yes, he can. He doesn't need Congress to give him permission to deport people. But it's very expensive to deport people because it requires all kinds of hearings and detention centers and so on. And so if he chooses to increase deportations, it's going to cost a huge amount of money that he'll have to get from somewhere else in the federal budget, which would reduce his ability to do things elsewhere. So executive orders are kind of interesting. And then there's executive privilege, which basically means that there are things that the president does that are not part of the public record, which is special for the president. So I have one of my best friends, she works for the Census Bureau, and if she sends me an email from her government account, or even from her private account on her government computer at work, and she's sending me her like great Aunt Ida's recipe for cookies or something, well, somebody could file a Freedom of Information Act to get access to all of her emails, and they could have that one and make the cookies all they wanted to, no matter how much of a secret that it was. But the president is sort of exempt from most of those rules. The things that occur in the president's office can be protected by executive privilege. And the argument is this: think about like Syria today. It's like a huge, enormous mess and is terribly sad and tragic, right? So perhaps the president wants to do something. Maybe I'm the president. I like this fictional scenario, fictional. And I'm the president. I want to do something about it, but I don't know what to do, right? Like, who do I help? If I'm going to help, if I intervene, do I put boots on the ground? Is that going to help or make things worse? How does that affect the stability of the Middle East as a whole? What do I do? So I call you together, my most trusted advisors. And that's a pretty controversial thing, right? To talk about doing something. Like, we all think it's sad, but to actually do something about it is much different. So it's pretty controversial. You all have your political careers in front of you. Maybe someday you want to be president or whatever. If you knew that every word that we said in our meeting would be public record, would you be inclined to give me your full and honest assessment? No, you would probably tell me the politically correct thing to say, or maybe just be quiet because you don't want to be on the record as saying something that turns out to be the wrong thing or whatever it is. So even though as president I ultimately have the responsibility for whatever policy we agree on in this office or in this meeting, you have your career to think about. I need you to be confident in confidentiality. So executive privilege is the idea that is a thing that is possible. But there is a limit to executive privilege, and I want you to write down the words U.S. versus Nixon. Because in U.S. versus Nixon, the Supreme Court ruled that there are limitations to executive privilege. So this was during the Watergate crisis, and they figured out that Nixon had recorded, had tapes of everything that had been said in the Oval Office. And Congress is trying to get access to those recordings. They subpoena them, ask the president to turn them over. He says, no, I have executive privilege. I can't reveal that. That would be detrimental to the security of the country. And the Supreme Court said, actually, no. At this point, there's plenty of evidence of wrongdoing. You have made you've provided no proof that anything in those tapes is going to threaten national security. You have to release the tapes. So there is a point at which executive privilege has its limits. Okay, so diplomatic, right, why would you record? Who knows? So then there's diplomatic powers, the president. Of course, the president can appoint all of those diplomats. He gets to figure out who's going to go to those places. That's a formal power, but informally, the president is in charge of diplomatic recognition. Think about President Obama and the country of Cuba. So for decades, the U.S. has not had diplomatic relations with this country of Cuba. But President Obama reversed that policy, reopened the U.S. embassy in Cuba, began communicating diplomatically with the government of Cuba. Now, Congress was in charge of the embargo, right? So it took a long time for Congress to lift the embargo. Congress is in charge of things like rules and restrictions governing travel, but the president got to decide, I want to recognize Cuba. It's, again, why people are a little bit anxious about President Trump's overtures towards Taiwan. Let me just finish quickly. There's not much left. The president negotiates treaties. Executive agreements are just treaties that don't require the approval of the Senate, except that they go away when that president leaves office. So an executive agreement is not as permanent as a treaty. And then finally, he's put in control of the military. You know that. For judicial, he appoints judges, but also the president has the power of pardon. That is a formal power. And then informally, the president can choose either to or not to implement the judicial proceeding. So if the court rules, the president doesn't enforce it, there's not much the court can do about that. So we'll stop there. Thank you for your patience.